While waiting for my appointment, a nurse came up to me and said, "Your daughter here is ready to be discharged." I was about to tell her I didn't have a daughter, but then I saw the teenage girl standing right behind her, staring right at me with wide, terrified eyes and her hands together like she was praying. She was mouthing the words, "Please say yes," while her whole body was shaking. Something in her face made me trust her. "Yes, sorry." I stood up quickly. "Let's go, honey." The nurse smiled and handed me a clipboard. She had a severe allergic reaction, but she's stable now. "Just sign here, Mrs. Kessler." I signed the fake name while the girl stayed close to me. Her hand grabbed my arm and I could feel her trembling. The nurse looked at the paperwork. "You can take her home now. Her father called earlier and said he's on his way if you needed to leave, but I told him you were already here." The girl's face went pale. Her fingers dug into my arm so hard it hurt. As soon as the nurse walked away, the girl whispered urgently, "We need to leave right now, before he gets here." We rushed toward the exit doors and I asked her what was happening. "Who's coming for you?" She was walking fast beside me. "I'm in foster care." "But they're not a real foster family." "What do you mean?" We pushed through the main doors into the parking lot. "There's 6 teenage girls in the house. They make us do online work for 12 hours every day. We're not allowed to stop." Her voice was shaking as we walked between parked cars. I looked at her closer now. Maybe 15 or 16. "We need to call the police right now." She shook her head hard. "I tried calling my caseworker last week. He found out." She pulled up her sleeve and showed me a dark bruise that wrapped around her upper arm. "He locked me in the basement for 3 days. My stomach dropped. "Who did this to you?" "My foster dad. But he works for the foster system. He's a placement coordinator." Nobody believes us because he knows how to make everything look legal. We were walking toward my car in the far corner of the lot. "What happened today? Why were you at the hospital?" "They make us take sleeping pills every night so we don't cause problems. But I'm allergic to something in them. My throat started closing up this morning, so they had to bring me here. I gave them a fake name, and when I saw you in the waiting room, I just took a chance. I pointed at you and said you were my mom. That was smart thinking." I fumbled for my car keys in my purse. The girl suddenly stopped walking. She grabbed my hand and pointed across the parking lot. "That's his car. He's already here." I looked where she was pointing. A silver Honda was parked 3 rows away. Empty. My heart started pounding. If his car is here, that means he's inside the hospital looking for you right now. We have to hide. He always wears his work badge on a blue lanyard. People trust him because they think he works at the hospital. She was practically hyperventilating. I could see my car now. It was only 30 feet away. "We need to get to my car while he's still inside searching." We started walking faster, trying to look normal, but my hands were shaking. The girl stayed close, using me as a shield. "He texted the other kids this morning." The girl's voice cracked. "He said if I ran away, he would make all of them pay for it. They're probably getting punished right now because of me." We were almost at my car when I heard someone call out, "Excuse me, ma'am." We both turned around. A tall, bald man with glasses was walking toward us from the hospital entrance. The girl froze completely beside me. Her breathing got really fast. "That's him. That's my foster dad." My blood went cold. I looked at the man's face as he got closer. I recognized him immediately. No, that can't be right." My voice barely worked. "That's him." The girl's fingernails dug into my hand. "Please don't let him take me back." The man was close enough now that I could see his face clearly. My mind was spinning. This couldn't be possible. "Pablo?" My voice came out strangled and weak. He stopped walking for just a second. Confusion crossed his face when he recognized me, but his eyes just dropped down to look at the girl holding my hand. "What are you doing here? And why do you have Madison?" The girl whispered next to me. "His real name is Pablo Reeves." Her voice shook. "He has 6 of us in that house. The foster paperwork is all fake." Pablo took a step closer. His voice was friendly, but there was an edge to it. "Kate," he told me, "you don't understand what's happening here. Madison gets confused. She has behavioral issues. Let me take her home so we can sort this out." He reached his hand toward the girl. "She's not going anywhere with you." I stepped in front of her. "She doesn't need your permission." His friendly mask was slipping. "Madison, get over here. Now?" The girl pressed against my back. Her face went gray as she realized me and Pablo knew each other. "Get away from us." I pulled out my phone. My hands were shaking so hard I could barely hold it. Pablo's expression shifted when he saw the phone. "You're really going to call the police on me?" My thumb hovered over 911. "Yes, I don't care that you're my brother. You're trafficking children. Family or not, you're a monster." I pressed the green call button and lifted the phone to my ear. My hand shook so hard I almost dropped it. Madison grabbed my jacket with both hands and pulled herself close. She whispered right next to my ear that Pablo knows cops who helped him before when other girls tried to run. The phone rang once. Pablo took another step toward us and his whole face changed. The friendly, concerned look disappeared completely. His eyes went cold and flat like he was looking at a problem he needed to solve. The phone rang a second time. Pablo spoke in this calm voice that made my skin crawl. He told me I was making a huge mistake. Madison was a troubled kid with a history of lying about her caregivers. She had behavioral issues documented in her file. The 911 operator answered and asked what my emergency was. I kept my eyes on Pablo while I talked. I told the operator there was a trafficking situation at County Hospital parking lot section C. Pablo's face went white when he heard me say trafficking. Madison was still pressed against my side and I could feel her whole body shaking. The operator asked me to repeat what I said and stay on the line. Pablo stared at me for 3 more seconds. Then he turned around and walked fast toward his silver Honda. He didn't run, but he moved quick. I watched him get in his car and pull out of the parking spot. The operator was asking me questions about how many people were involved and if anyone was injured. I answered while watching Pablo's car drive toward the exit. Madison whispered that he was leaving to go hurt the other girls. The operator told me officers were on their way and to stay where I was. 4 minutes later, 2 police cars pulled into the lot with their lights on but no sirens. The officers got out and walked toward us. I put my phone away and stood up straighter. Madison moved behind me and grabbed the back of my shirt. One officer was older with gray hair and the other was younger, maybe 30. The older officer asked what was going on. I explained everything as fast as I could. Madison was a foster kid being trafficked. 6 girls total in a house. My brother Pablo Reeves ran the operation. He was a placement coordinator who made everything look legal. The younger officer's face changed when I said Pablo's name. He looked at the older officer and said he knew Pablo Reeves. Respected guy who worked in foster placement. My stomach dropped. The older officer asked Madison if what I said was true. She nodded but didn't speak. Her fingers dug into my shirt. The younger officer said they needed to take separate statements. He asked Madison to come with him to the other patrol car. Madison's breathing got really fast. She pressed harder against my back. I shouted that she stays with me or I'm calling a lawyer right now. Both officers stopped. The older one held up his hands and said they were just trying to get clear information. I told them Madison was terrified, and I was the only person she trusted. They could ask questions with both of us together, or we weren't cooperating. The officers looked at each other. The younger one shrugged. They spent 20 minutes asking us questions in the parking lot. Madison answered in a quiet voice while holding my hand. She told them about the house and the other girls and the online work. The officers wrote everything down. Then the older officer said they needed to take Madison to the station for a formal interview. I said I was coming with her. The officer said that wasn't standard procedure. I told him I didn't care about procedure. Madison identified me as her mother at the hospital. I was the adult responsible for her, and I wasn't letting her go anywhere alone. The younger officer said it would actually be helpful to have me there since Madison was clearly more comfortable. We all got in our cars and drove to the police station. The whole drive I watched Madison in my rearview mirror sitting in the back of the patrol car. She looked so small. At the station, they took us to a plain room with a table and chairs. The walls were gray and there was a camera in the corner. A detective came in about 10 minutes later. He was maybe 40 with dark hair and tired eyes. He introduced himself as Detective Santos. His voice was serious, but not mean. He sat down across from us and asked Madison to tell him everything from the beginning. Madison's voice shook while she talked. She described all 6 girls and the 12-hour shifts doing online work, the sleeping pills they had to take, the basement where Pablo locked her for 3 days. Detective Santos wrote notes and asked questions. He wanted to know the exact address of the house, the layout of the rooms, the other girls' names. Madison knew everything. Tiana was 17 and the oldest. Larissa had been there the longest at 16. She named the other 3 girls too. Santos asked about Pablo's daily routine. When he left for work, when he came home, if anyone else came to the house. Madison answered every question with specific details. Her hands shook the whole time. Detective Santos leaned back in his chair. His expression had changed from skeptical to concerned. He said this needed immediate investigation. He asked Madison about the online work she mentioned. She looked down at the table. She said they did content creation for 12 hours every day. She wouldn't say what kind of content. Pablo collected all the money they made. He charged them for food and clothes and everything else, so they never had any money of their own. Detective Santos asked how much money. Madison said she didn't know the total, but Pablo showed them spreadsheets sometimes. Thousands of dollars every month. Her whole body was shaking now. Santos got up and brought her a cup of water and a blanket from somewhere. She wrapped it around her shoulders. He asked more questions about the sleeping pills and the allergic reaction. Madison explained they took pills every night so they wouldn't cause problems. She was allergic to something in them. This morning her throat closed up and Pablo had to take her to the hospital. She gave them a fake name. When she saw me in the waiting room, she took a chance and said I was her mom. Detective Santos nodded and wrote more notes. He asked about the basement punishment. Madison pulled up her sleeve again and showed the dark bruise. She said Pablo locked her down there for 3 days last week because she tried to call her caseworker. No food, no bathroom, just darkness. Her voice broke when she said it. Santos put down his pen. He said he needed to make some calls and he'd be right back. He left the room. Madison started crying. Real crying with her shoulders shaking and tears running down her face. I held her hand and told her she was safe now. She kept saying she was sorry. Sorry for getting me involved. Sorry for ruining my life. She understood if I wanted to leave now that I knew it was my own brother. I squeezed her hand harder. I told her she had nothing to be sorry for. Pablo was the one who should be sorry. She didn't ruin anything. Some things were more important than family. She looked at me with red eyes and asked if I really meant that. I said yes. I wasn't going anywhere. Madison looked up at me with red, puffy eyes. Her whole face was wet from crying. She wiped her nose with the back of her hand and tried to stop shaking. I squeezed her fingers tighter and told her Pablo stopped being my brother the second I found out what he was doing to kids. She sucked in a breath and her eyes got even wider. I said family doesn't mean anything when someone hurts children like this. She nodded really fast, and more tears ran down her face, but these looked different somehow. Like maybe she actually believed me. Her shoulders relaxed just a tiny bit, and she leaned against my arm. And I could feel her breathing slow down from that panicked gasping to something more normal. The door opened, and Detective Santos came back in carrying a folder. He sat down across from us, and his face looked serious, but not in a bad way. He said he just got off the phone with patrol officers, and they were heading to Pablo's house right now to check on the other girls. Madison's whole body jerked forward. Her face changed from scared to something like hope mixed with fear. She asked if they were really going there right now. Santos nodded and said they should arrive in about 15 minutes. Madison pressed both hands against her mouth. She started crying again, but also kind of laughing at the same time. Then her face went gray, and she grabbed my hand so hard it hurt. She whispered that the other girls were probably getting punished right now because of her. I told her this wasn't her fault, but she shook her head hard. She said Pablo told them this morning that if she ran away, everyone would pay for it. Santos leaned forward and said the officers would see if anyone was hurt, and they'd document everything. Madison nodded, but she looked sick. 2 hours crawled by while we sat in that room. Santos brought us sandwiches from somewhere, but Madison barely touched hers. She kept staring at the door waiting for news. I pulled out my phone and scrolled through my contacts until I found Owen's number. My ex-husband and I hadn't talked in maybe 3 months. I typed out a message asking if he still knew any lawyers who handled trafficking cases. I hit send before I could overthink it. My phone rang 30 seconds later. Owen's voice came through asking what the hell was happening. I gave him the short version about Madison and Pablo and the 6 girls. He went quiet for a long time. Then he said he was calling someone right now and he'd get back to me in 10 minutes. Madison watched me put my phone down. She asked who that was, and I told her my ex-husband used to be a lawyer before he switched careers. He still had connections with people who did this kind of work. She nodded and went back to staring at the door. My phone buzzed again 20 minutes later. Owen said he had a friend named Jamie who specialized in child advocacy cases, and she was willing to come to the station right now. He asked for the address and said he was coming too. I felt something loosen in my chest, knowing we'd have actual legal help. Owen showed up 40 minutes later with a woman who looked maybe 50 with short gray hair and intense eyes. She walked straight to Detective Santos and stuck out her hand. She said her name was Jamie, and she understood there was a minor in need of legal representation. Santos shook her hand and looked at me. I nodded and said I'd asked Owen to bring someone who could help Madison. Jamie pulled out a chair and sat down next to Madison. She asked Madison if she was okay with Jamie being here, and Madison said yes. Then Jamie started firing questions at Santos about protective custody arrangements and where Madison was supposed to stay tonight. Santos explained that normally she'd go back into foster placement, but given the circumstances, that seemed complicated. Jamie's face got hard. She said complicated wasn't the word she'd use. She said Pablo had access to every placement record in the system and could find Madison wherever they put her. We needed emergency housing that was completely off the official grid. Santos rubbed his face and said he'd have to make some calls about that. His phone rang before he could pick it up. He answered, and his expression changed while he listened. His jaw got tight and he wrote something down on his notepad. He said okay thanks and hung up. Then he looked at all of us, and I knew it was bad news before he even opened his mouth. He said the officers just left Pablo's house. All 6 girls were present and accounted for. The house looked normal and clean. The girls said everything was fine and they didn't know what Madison was talking about. Pablo was cooperative and answered every question. Madison made a sound like someone punched her in the stomach. Her breathing got really fast and loud. She stood up so quick her chair fell backward. She said no, no, no over and over while her hands pulled at her hair. I jumped up and grabbed her shoulders. She was shaking so hard I thought she might fall down. Jamie moved fast and caught Madison's other arm. We got her back in the chair and Jamie knelt in front of her. Madison couldn't stop gasping for air. She said Pablo makes them practice exactly what to say if anyone ever comes to check. He probably texted them the second he left the hospital. He threatened them. They're too scared to tell the truth. Her voice came out all broken and desperate. Jamie asked Santos if the officers noticed anything wrong with the girls. Santos looked at his notes and said they seemed nervous but nothing obvious. No visible injuries or signs of distress. Pablo showed them his placement coordinator badge and all the foster paperwork. Everything looked legal and above board. The house was clean with plenty of food. Each girl had her own bedroom. Jamie sat back in her chair and her face was angry now. She said this was textbook institutional trafficking. The perpetrator uses his official position as cover, and the victims are too scared to speak up because he has all the power. I felt something hot building in my chest. My hands started shaking, but not from fear this time. I said Pablo created a perfect system where nobody would ever believe the girls over him. He had credentials and fake paperwork, and he knew exactly how to make everything look right. Jamie nodded and said she'd seen cases like this before. The system protects the abuser because he's part of the system itself. Santos closed his folder and leaned back. He said he believed Madison and he believed something wrong was happening in that house, but he needed more evidence before he could arrest Pablo or remove the girls. Madison's testimony alone wasn't enough when the other victims were denying everything, and Pablo had spotless professional credentials. He needed something concrete that would hold up in court. Jamie asked what kind of evidence he was looking for. Santos said medical records, financial documentation, witness testimony from someone besides Madison, physical evidence from the house, Anything that corroborated Madison's story beyond her word against Pablo's. I looked at Madison and her face was completely pale. She looked like she might throw up. I put my arm around her shoulders and told Santos we'd get him whatever evidence he needed. Pablo wasn't going to get away with this. Owen spoke up from where he'd been sitting quietly in the corner. He said we needed to get Madison a full medical exam right now to document everything. Not just the allergic reaction, but any other signs of what Pablo had done to her. Jamie nodded immediately and said that was smart thinking because it would create an official paper trail that Pablo couldn't dispute. She explained that medical evidence might reveal things Madison hadn't even mentioned yet, because sometimes victims don't realize certain injuries or symptoms are connected to their abuse. Detective Santos agreed and said he could arrange for a forensic nurse examiner at a different hospital across town where Pablo had no connections or influence. Madison looked scared when they mentioned another hospital, but I squeezed her hand and told her this was important. We needed proof that would hold up in court. She nodded slowly and whispered, "Okay." Within 20 minutes, we were in Owen's car driving to County Hospital on the other side of the city. Madison sat in the back seat staring out the window and picking at her fingernails. I could see her hands shaking every time we stopped at a red light. Jamie followed in her own car and met us in the emergency room entrance. She had already called ahead, and a forensic nurse examiner was waiting for us in a private examination room. The nurse introduced herself and explained to Madison exactly what the exam would involve. She would document any bruises, injuries, or signs of malnutrition. She would photograph everything and write a detailed report. Madison's eyes filled with tears, but she agreed. The nurse asked me to wait outside during the examination, because it needed to be conducted without any potential influence from adults. Jamie stayed with Madison as her advocate while Owen and I sat in the waiting room. My hands wouldn't stop shaking. I pulled out my phone and stared at it for a long time before I finally worked up the courage to call my parents. They needed to hear this from me before Pablo got to them with his version of events. My father, Bo, answered on the third ring. I could hear the television in the background. I told him I needed to talk to him about something serious involving Pablo. His voice immediately got tense and he asked what was going on. I explained that I was at a hospital with a teenage girl who had escaped from Pablo's foster house. I told him Pablo was trafficking children and I had reported him to the police. The silence on the other end lasted so long I thought the call had dropped. Then my father exploded. His voice got loud and angry as he demanded to know what I was talking about. He said I must be confused or mistaken because Pablo would never do something like that. I tried to explain about Madison and the other 5 girls, but he cut me off. He said I was manipulated by a troubled teenager who probably had behavioral problems. He demanded I bring this girl back to Pablo immediately and stop causing problems for the family. My chest got tight and I could barely breathe. I told him I saw Pablo at the hospital myself trying to take Madison. I explained that she had physical evidence of abuse and that a forensic nurse was examining her right now. My father's voice got even angrier. He said foster kids often come from bad situations and have injuries from previous placements. He accused me of jumping to conclusions about my own brother, without knowing the full story. He said Pablo had dedicated his career to helping troubled youth, and I was destroying his reputation with false accusations. I felt sick to my stomach. I asked him why he was so quick to defend Pablo without even listening to what I was telling him. He said because Pablo was his son, and he knew him better than some random teenager I'd just met. The conversation went in circles for another 5 minutes with him refusing to believe anything I said. Finally, he told me I needed to think very carefully about what I was doing to the family reputation. He said he was calling Pablo right now to get his side of the story. Then he hung up on me. I sat there staring at my phone feeling like I might throw up. Owen put his hand on my shoulder and asked if I was okay. I shook my head because I wasn't okay. My own father had just chosen Pablo over the truth. He was going to side with my brother no matter what evidence I showed him. 40 minutes later, Madison came out of the examination room looking completely exhausted. Her eyes were red from crying, and she walked slowly like every step hurt. The forensic nurse pulled Jamie aside and they talked in low voices for several minutes. I watched Jamie's face get more and more serious as the nurse showed her a tablet with photos and documentation. Jamie's jaw clenched and her hands formed fists at her sides. When they finished talking, Jamie came over to where Owen and I were sitting. Her expression was grim. She told us the medical exam had found signs of long-term sleep deprivation, including dark circles, delayed reflexes, and cognitive fog. Madison had repetitive strain injuries in her hands and wrists, consistent with constant computer work for extended periods. There were multiple bruises in various stages of healing that showed a pattern of being struck with objects, rather than accidental injuries. The nurse had also found evidence of malnutrition with Madison's weight significantly below healthy range for her age and height. Jamie said the allergic reaction to the sleeping pills could have been fatal if Madison hadn't gotten to the hospital when she did. Her throat had been closing and another 30 minutes might have been too late. I felt rage building in my chest as Jamie described each finding. This was so much worse than what Madison had initially told us. Detective Santos called while we were still at the hospital, and Jamie filled him in on the medical evidence. I could hear his voice through the phone sounding excited. He said this gave him enough for an emergency warrant to seize Pablo's computers and financial records. He explained it would take a few days to execute the warrant, but now they had legal grounds to dig deeper into Pablo's operation. When Jamie hung up, she looked at Madison and asked where she was supposed to stay tonight. The foster placement system was obviously compromised since Pablo had access to all those records. I wasn't an approved guardian, so technically Madison couldn't stay with me. Jamie thought for a moment, then said, Madison should stay with me informally while she filed emergency custody paperwork first thing in the morning. It wasn't exactly legal, but it was safer than putting Madison back into a system that Pablo could manipulate. Owen pulled Jamie aside while Madison was getting her jacket and offered to stay at my apartment with us. He said Pablo might try to show up, and it would be better if there was someone else there besides just me and Madison. I felt relief wash over me because I was actually scared Pablo knew where I lived. Jamie thought it was a good idea and said she would start the emergency guardianship paperwork first thing in the morning. We left the hospital around 11:30 and drove across town to my apartment. Madison sat in the back seat staring out the window without saying anything. Owen followed us in his car. The streets were mostly empty, and I kept checking my rearview mirror to make sure Pablo wasn't following us. My hands were shaking on the steering wheel. We pulled into my apartment complex parking lot just before midnight. Owen parked next to us and helped carry Madison's things inside. She didn't have any belongings with her since she escaped from the hospital wearing just the clothes she had on. I gave her some of my old pajamas and set her up in my guest room with clean sheets and extra blankets. She kept saying thank you over and over. She apologized for ruining my life and causing problems with my family. I sat on the edge of the bed and told her she had nothing to be sorry for. I said she was safe now, and that was all that mattered. She looked at me with tears in her eyes and nodded. Owen made himself comfortable on my couch with a pillow and blanket. I went to my bedroom but couldn't fall asleep. I lay there in the dark thinking about the 5 other girls still trapped in Pablo's house. They were probably getting punished right now because Madison escaped. Pablo would be angry and taking it out on them. I kept thinking about my brother and trying to remember him as a kid. We used to play together in the backyard. He taught me how to ride a bike. I couldn't understand how that person turned into someone who would hurt children. My brain couldn't make those 2 versions of Pablo fit together. I finally fell asleep around 4 in the morning and woke up 3 hours later when my phone rang. It was Jamie calling. She told me she was filing for emergency guardianship on my behalf that morning. She explained it would give me legal authority to make decisions for Madison. The hearing was scheduled for 3 days from now. I thanked her and hung up. Then Detective Santos called 20 minutes later. He said Pablo had hired an expensive defense attorney overnight. The lawyer was already claiming Madison had a documented history of behavioral problems and false accusations against previous foster families. My stomach dropped when I heard this. I realized Pablo had been preparing for this possibility. He had fake paperwork ready to discredit Madison before she even escaped. Detective Santos said they would need strong evidence to counter Pablo's defense strategy. I felt my hopes starting to sink. Madison came out of the guest room and heard me talking on the phone. She asked what was wrong. I told her about Pablo's lawyer and the fake behavioral reports. Her face went pale. She sat down at my kitchen table and explained that Pablo kept detailed files on all 6 girls. He created fake behavioral reports documenting made-up problems and incidents. He used these files to discredit them if they ever tried to report him. It made them look like troubled kids who couldn't be trusted. She said Pablo had been building these files for months. Owen came over from the couch and listened to Madison explain Pablo's system. He suggested we try to contact the other 5 girls directly. Maybe one of them would be willing to talk now that Madison was safely out. Jamie called back and warned that contacting the girls could be considered interference with the investigation. But Detective Santos said if the girls reached out to us voluntarily, that would be different. Madison remembered an email address that one of the girls named Tiana had memorized before Pablo took their phones away. Tiana was the oldest girl at 17. I created a new email account using a fake name so Pablo couldn't trace it. Madison helped me write a message to Tiana. We explained that Madison was safe and staying with someone who wanted to help. We asked if Tiana wanted help getting out too. We sent the email around 9 in the morning. Then we waited. 6 hours passed with no response. I started thinking Pablo had already changed all their passwords or blocked their access somehow. Madison kept checking my phone every few minutes looking for a reply. Owen ordered pizza for lunch, but none of us ate much. I was staring at my phone when it finally buzzed at 3:15. A new email from an account I didn't recognize. The message said this is Tiana and that he took their phones, but she was on a computer at the public library. She said she was scared. My hand started shaking as I read it. Madison grabbed my arm and read over my shoulder. I typed back immediately asking if she was safe right now. She replied that she had to sign out a library computer for 1 hour, and Pablo thought she was at a school study group. We emailed back and forth for the next 20 minutes. Tiana confirmed everything Madison had told us about the house and the online work. She added that Pablo threatened all of them this morning. He said if anyone tried to leave, he would report them as runaways. That would send them to juvenile detention because they had no other family. Tiana said the younger girls were too scared to even think about escaping now. She asked if Madison was really okay, and if we could actually help them get out. I told her yes, and that we had a lawyer and detective working on the case. Then Tiana's messages stopped coming. Madison said her library hour must have ended. We sat there staring at my phone, hoping she would log back on, but nothing came through. I forwarded Tiana's last message to Detective Santos right away and called him. He picked up on the second ring, and I explained that we'd been emailing with another girl from Pablo's house who confirmed everything Madison said. Detective Santos asked me to send him screenshots of the entire conversation and said this was exactly what they needed. A second victim willing to talk changed everything. He asked if Tiana could come to the police station tomorrow during her school lunch period when Pablo wouldn't be monitoring her. I told him I'd email her back and ask. Madison was sitting next to me on the couch looking hopeful for the first time in days. I typed a message to Tiana explaining that Detective Santos wanted to meet with her tomorrow at lunch and that we could keep her safe. I hit send and we waited. 20 minutes later, Tiana replied saying she could get to the station if we gave her the address. She added more details about the other girls in the house. One girl named Larissa had been with Pablo the longest, almost 2 years. Tiana said Larissa was so scared of leaving that Pablo had convinced her nobody else would ever take care of her. The other 3 girls were younger, and they all followed whatever Larissa did. Tiana said if Larissa stayed, then the younger girls would stay too because they trusted her judgment. I read this to Madison and she nodded. She said Larissa used to talk about running away when she first got there, but Pablo broke her down over time. He told her she was too damaged for anyone else to want her. Madison's voice got quiet when she said Pablo used the same approach on all of them. I sent the information to Detective Santos and he called back within 5 minutes. He sounded excited and said having 2 victims willing to testify gave them enough to execute the computer seizure warrant. He told me to give Tiana the station address and he'd arrange everything for tomorrow. After I hung up, Owen made dinner while Madison and I sat at the kitchen table. She kept checking my phone every few minutes to see if Tiana sent anything else. Around 8 that night, my phone rang with my mother's number. I almost didn't answer, but something made me pick up. My mother was crying before I even said hello. She begged me to drop these accusations against Pablo and explained that my father had a long talk with him earlier. Pablo told them that Madison was a pathological liar, with a documented history of making false abuse claims against foster families. My mother's voice shook as she said Pablo showed them official paperwork proving Madison had accused 3 other families of terrible things. I tried to interrupt, but she kept talking. She said Pablo was heartbroken that I would believe a troubled teenager over my own brother. I finally got a word in and told her about the medical evidence from the hospital. I mentioned Tiana's testimony and the other girls trapped in that house. My mother went quiet for a second, then said Pablo had already explained all of that. He showed them Madison's complete foster file with psychological evaluations and incident reports from previous placements. The file documented Madison making up stories about abuse to get attention. My stomach dropped as I realized Pablo's fake documentation was working exactly how Madison said it would. My mother said the therapist's notes in the file showed Madison had serious behavioral issues and a pattern of manipulating adults. I told my mother those files were fake and that Pablo created them to discredit the girls if they ever reported him. She asked how I could possibly know that, and I said because Madison told me his whole system. My mother's crying got louder, and she said I was choosing to believe a stranger's lies over my own family. She told me everyone was standing behind Pablo, and if I continued with these accusations, I was cutting myself off from all of them. I tried to explain about the medical evidence and Detective Santos's investigation, but she wasn't listening. She said I had a choice to make right now. Either admit I was wrong about Pablo or lose my entire family. I opened my mouth to respond, but she hung up before I could say anything. I sat there staring at my phone screen. Owen came over and asked what happened, but I couldn't form words. Madison appeared in the doorway looking worried. I just shook my head and she walked into the kitchen. She saw my face and immediately started apologizing. She said she was sorry for destroying my family and that she should never have dragged me into this mess. I looked at her standing there looking so small and scared. I told her she didn't destroy anything. Pablo did this, not her. She said my whole family was going to hate me because of her, but I said some things matter more than family loyalty. The next morning, Tiana showed up at the police station during her lunch period like Detective Santos arranged. Madison wanted to go, but Detective Santos said it was better if Tiana gave her statement without other witnesses present. Tiana spent 2 hours in an interview room giving a recorded statement that matched everything Madison had told us. Detective Santos called me afterward and said having 2 victims corroborating the same details meant they could execute the warrant immediately. He sounded energized in a way he hadn't before. That afternoon, while Pablo was at his office, 6 police officers showed up at his house with the seizure warrant. They took all 6 computers from the girls' rooms, plus Pablo's laptop and desktop. They also seized boxes of financial records and the fake behavioral files Madison had mentioned. One officer called Detective Santos to report they found a locked filing cabinet in Pablo's bedroom, containing files on all 6 girls with fabricated incident reports and psychological evaluations. Pablo showed up at the house during the middle of the search. His lawyer arrived 15 minutes after that. Detective Santos called me that evening and his voice was different, more serious. He said the initial computer forensics were worse than he expected. They found evidence of all 6 girls' online accounts generating significant income that Pablo controlled completely. The girls had been doing content creation work for paying subscribers, but never saw any of the money. Pablo kept spreadsheets tracking each girl's daily earnings down to the dollar. He also tracked expenses he charged them for basic things like food and clothes. The girls were essentially working 12-hour days while going deeper into debt to him. I asked how much money we were talking about, and Detective Santos paused before answering. He said the financial records showed Pablo made over $400,000 in the past 2 years from the girls' online work. He was also collecting foster care payments for all 6 girls from the state. The prosecutor was already talking about upgrading the charges from abuse to human trafficking and fraud. This wasn't just a bad foster parent anymore. This was organized criminal enterprise. The next morning, Detective Santos called to say officers were heading to Pablo's office with an arrest warrant. I put the phone on speaker so Madison could hear, and she grabbed my hand while we listened. He said they had enough evidence from the computers and financial records to charge Pablo with 6 counts of human trafficking, plus child exploitation, fraud, and false imprisonment. The bail hearing was scheduled for that afternoon, and prosecutors were asking for $500,000 because Pablo had the resources and connections to run. Madison started crying when she heard the amount because she said Pablo's parents had money and would probably pay it. I told her even if they did, Pablo wouldn't be able to come near her because of the protection order. 2 hours later, Detective Santos texted that Pablo was in custody, and his parents were already at the courthouse talking to a bail bondsman. My phone rang 20 minutes after that, and I saw it was my father calling. I almost didn't answer, but Madison was watching me, so I picked up. My father started yelling before I could even say hello. He told me I had destroyed Pablo's life and his career over lies from troubled teenagers who were known for making things up. His voice was shaking with anger as he said Pablo's lawyer would prove all of this was fabricated, and then I would have to live with what I had done to the family. I tried to explain about the medical evidence and financial records, but he talked right over me. He said I had always been jealous of Pablo's success, and this was my way of tearing him down. I felt my own anger rising and told him I had medical documentation of abuse, financial records showing $400,000 in stolen earnings, and 2 victims willing to testify under oath. My father went quiet for a second, and then said Pablo's lawyer already explained how all of that evidence could be misinterpreted by people who wanted to believe the worst. He said the bruises could be from anything. The money was legitimate income Pablo earned through his consulting business, and troubled foster kids often made up stories for attention. I asked him if he really believed that, or if he was just protecting Pablo because he couldn't accept the truth. He told me not to contact him or my mother again, until I was ready to apologize to Pablo for what I had put him through. The line went dead and I sat there staring at my phone. Madison asked if I was okay and I lied and said yes. 3 days later, Detective Santos called with news that Child Protective Services was finally removing the other 5 girls from Pablo's house. I asked if they could stay together, but he said they were being placed in separate emergency foster homes across the county. When I told Madison, she looked like I had hit her. She said those girls were all each other had, and now they were being split up because of her. I tried to explain it wasn't her fault, but she just shook her head and went to her room. Jamie came over that evening to check on us, and I asked her why the girls couldn't stay together when they needed each other for support. She sat down at my kitchen table and explained that separating them was standard procedure in trafficking cases. Pablo's lawyer would argue the girls coordinated their testimony if they stayed in contact, so prosecutors needed them apart temporarily to prove their stories matched independently. I said it felt cruel to punish victims by isolating them from their only support system. Jamie agreed it was terrible, but said it was the only way to build a case strong enough that Pablo couldn't walk free. The next morning, a social worker named Katya Nakamura showed up at my apartment to interview Madison. She had a clipboard and a cold expression that made me uncomfortable immediately. Madison sat on the couch looking small and scared while Katya asked her questions. But the questions felt wrong from the start. Katya kept asking if I had coached Madison on what to say to police, and whether Madison might be exaggerating things for attention. She asked if Madison understood the serious consequences of making false accusations against someone in Pablo's position. Madison's hands were shaking as she tried to answer, and I could see her shutting down the way she did when she felt unsafe. I interrupted and asked Katya why she was interrogating the victim, instead of investigating how Pablo had operated a trafficking ring under the foster system's nose for years. Katya looked at me with this annoyed expression, and said Pablo had an exemplary record with the department, and this situation was highly unusual. She said it was her job to determine if the allegations were credible, or if Madison had behavioral issues that might explain her claims. And I felt my temper snap and told her to get out of my apartment. Katya stood up slowly and said she would be filing a report about my hostile and uncooperative behavior. As soon as she left, I called Jamie and explained what happened. Jamie was quiet for a minute and then said she was filing a formal complaint against Katya for victim intimidation. But she said she would also request a different social worker be assigned to Madison's case immediately. Detective Santos backed up the complaint when Jamie contacted him, and 2 days later we got notice that Katya had been removed from the investigation. Madison's emergency guardianship hearing arrived on a cold Tuesday morning 3 weeks after I first saw her in that hospital waiting room. We walked into the courthouse together, and Madison's hand was freezing in mine. Pablo's lawyer was already there in an expensive suit, and he gave me this look that made my skin crawl. The hearing started and Pablo's lawyer stood up first. He argued I was an unsuitable guardian with no experience raising children and questionable motives for getting involved. He said Madison would be better served returning to foster placement with a properly trained and licensed family. He made it sound like I was some kind of predator who had manipulated a vulnerable teenager. Jamie stood up and presented the medical evidence documenting Madison's injuries and malnutrition. She had photos that made the judge lean forward to look closer. Detective Santos testified about the ongoing criminal investigation and the evidence they had collected from Pablo's computers and financial records. He explained how the case had expanded into a federal trafficking investigation. Then it was Madison's turn to speak. She walked up to the witness stand and the judge asked her to explain why she wanted to stay with me. Madison's voice shook as she said I was the first person who had protected her in years, and she felt safe in my apartment. She said the idea of going back into the foster system made her feel sick, because she couldn't trust anyone in that system anymore. She looked right at the judge and said if she had to go back, she would run away the first chance she got. The judge was quiet for a long time after Madison finished talking. He looked at all the evidence and then at me. He asked if I understood the responsibility I was taking on, and whether I was prepared for the challenges ahead. I said yes and meant it. The judge granted me temporary guardianship for 90 days with a review hearing scheduled at the end of that period. Madison started crying and grabbed my hand as we walked out of the courtroom. Jamie hugged us both in the hallway and said this was just the first step, but it was a good one. 3 days after the hearing, my doorbell rang at 8 in the morning. I looked through the peephole and my stomach dropped when I saw my parents standing in the hallway. Madison was still asleep in her room and I stood frozen trying to decide what to do. My mother pressed the doorbell again and called out that she knew I was home. I opened the door but kept the chain lock attached. My father pushed forward and demanded I let them inside so they could talk to Madison. He said she needed to tell them the truth about what really happened with Pablo. I told them Madison was sleeping and they needed to leave. My mother started crying and said I was keeping them from their granddaughter. I reminded her Madison wasn't their granddaughter and they had no legal right to see her. My father's face turned red and he pushed against the door. The chain held, but I stepped back and yelled for Owen. He came running from the kitchen and saw my father trying to force the door open. Owen told them to back away, or he was calling the police. My mother screamed that I had turned into a monster who destroyed their family. She said I stole their son's life over lies from a disturbed teenager. Pulled out my phone with shaking hands and dialed 911. My father finally stopped pushing the door and stared at me like he didn't recognize me. I told the operator my parents were violating a protection order and trying to force entry into my apartment. My mother kept crying and saying I was choosing a stranger over my own family. Owen stood next to me at the door and his presence made me feel less alone. 2 officers arrived 12 minutes later, and I opened the door to let them in while my parents waited in the hallway. The officers checked the protection order paperwork, and then went into the hall to talk to my parents. I could hear one officer explaining they were violating the court order by coming to my home. My mother's voice got louder as she insisted they just wanted to see their granddaughter and make sure she was safe. The officer told her Madison wasn't their granddaughter and they had no custody rights. He said if they came back, they would be arrested for violating the protection order. My mother screamed that I had turned into a monster who was stealing their son's life. My father stood silent and wouldn't even look at me as the officers escorted them to the elevator. After they left, I sat on the couch and cried while Owen made coffee. Madison came out of her bedroom asking what happened, and I told her my parents had tried to visit. She apologized for causing problems with my family, and I told her she had nothing to apologize for. 2 weeks passed, and Detective Santos called saying Larissa had finally agreed to give a statement. He explained the other girls' testimonies had convinced her Pablo couldn't retaliate anymore. Jamie and I took Madison to the police station where Larissa was waiting in an interview room. The girls hugged each other and cried for several minutes before Detective Santos started the recording. Larissa's statement lasted almost 4 hours because she had been with Pablo the longest and witnessed everything from the beginning. She described how Pablo started with just 1 or 2 girls doing real online tutoring for school subjects. The work was legitimate at first, and he seemed like a caring foster parent who wanted to help. Then he gradually shifted to different kinds of online content that made more money. He isolated them from outside contact by taking their phones and monitoring all their communications. Larissa said Pablo told them they were lucky to have a home because most foster kids ended up on the streets. He convinced them the online work was necessary to pay for their food and housing. She explained how the sleeping pills started after one girl tried to run away. Pablo said the pills would help them rest better, but really he used them to keep everyone compliant and too tired to cause problems. Larissa provided names of 4 other men Pablo worked with who placed girls in similar situations. She said these men operated across 3 different states, and Pablo bragged about how much money the network was making. Detective Santos asked specific questions about financial records, and Larissa described seeing Pablo's spreadsheets tracking each girl's earnings. She said Pablo charged them for everything including food and clothes so they could never save enough money to leave. The statement included details about the basement where Pablo locked girls as punishment. Larissa had been down there twice and described the cold concrete floor and the bucket he left for a bathroom. By the time the interview ended, Detective Santos looked shaken and said this case was bigger than anyone realized. The next day, Detective Santos contacted the FBI because Larissa's testimony showed interstate trafficking. An agent named Anastasia Chang called me directly and asked to meet with Madison. She explained Pablo's operation was part of a larger network of corrupt foster system employees running similar schemes. Agent Chang interviewed Madison for 6 hours and recorded everything about Pablo's methods and the other men involved. She said the federal government was building a massive case that would expose vulnerabilities in the foster system. Within a week, the investigation exploded into a multi-state operation with FBI agents raiding homes in Ohio, Pennsylvania, and West Virginia. 17 more girls were found in situations identical to what Madison described. Agent Chang kept me updated as they built the federal case against Pablo and the 4 other men. She said the evidence was overwhelming with financial records showing millions of dollars moving through the network. Pablo's lawyer tried to negotiate a plea deal, but Jamie explained the federal charges carried mandatory minimum sentences. The prosecutors wanted to make an example of the case to force reforms in foster care oversight. Pablo's lawyer kept pushing for reduced charges, but Agent Chang said the trafficking evidence was too strong. Jamie told me the prosecutors were determined to show that working within the system didn't protect traffickers from consequences. The legal process dragged on for weeks with constant motions and hearings. Madison had to testify before a grand jury, which terrified her, but she did it anyway. I sat outside the courtroom while she gave her testimony and held her hand when she came out crying. 3 months after Madison escaped from the hospital, Pablo stood in federal court and pleaded guilty to all charges. The judge sentenced him to 28 years in federal prison with no possibility of early release. The 4 other men in the network received similar sentences ranging from 22 to 30 years. Agent Chang called to tell me they had rescued 17 more girls from various locations and shut down the entire trafficking network. She said Madison's bravery in that hospital parking lot had saved dozens of lives. I cried when I hung up the phone because the reality of what could have happened to Madison finally hit me. If she hadn't pointed at me in that waiting room, she would still be trapped in Pablo's house or worse. The 5 other girls from Pablo's house were placed in separate foster homes across the county. Jamie explained they needed different placements to prevent any appearance of coordinating testimony. Madison asked constantly about Tiana and Larissa and whether they were safe. Their therapists arranged supervised video calls twice a month so the girls could stay connected. I sat with Madison during the first call and watched her face light up when she saw Tiana on the screen. They talked about their new schools and their therapy sessions. Larissa joined the call and told Madison she was learning to play guitar in her new placement. All 3 girls struggled with trust issues and anxiety, but they were slowly adjusting. Madison's therapist said maintaining these connections was important for their recovery, even though they couldn't see each other in person yet. My parents sent an email through their lawyer 6 weeks after Pablo's sentencing. The message acknowledged that Pablo had confessed to everything and asked if I would be willing to meet with them to talk. I read the email 3 times trying to figure out how I felt. Part of me wanted to see them and try to rebuild some kind of relationship, but most of me felt angry that it took a confession and a 28-year sentence for them to believe me. I wrote back through Jamie saying I needed more time to process everything that happened. I told them I wasn't ready to meet yet and didn't know when I would be. My mother responded asking if Madison would be willing to meet them instead. I deleted that email without answering because Madison had enough to deal with without my parents trying to insert themselves into her life. Madison started therapy twice a week with a specialist in trafficking trauma. She enrolled in online school because regular classrooms triggered her anxiety too badly. The thought of being in a room with other teenagers made her panic. Her therapist said this was normal and they would work toward regular school when Madison felt ready. Some days were good and Madison seemed almost like a regular teenager watching movies and talking about music. Other days she barely left her room and I could hear her crying through the door. She had nightmares most nights and would wake up screaming. The sleeping pills Pablo forced on her had created an association between sleep and danger. Her therapist prescribed different medication to help, but Madison was terrified to take anything. I sat with her every night until she fell asleep and left my bedroom door open so she could come get me if she had a nightmare. Progress was slow, but the therapist said Madison was doing better than most trafficking survivors at this stage. I watched her slowly start to trust that she was really safe, and that nobody was going to take her back. Some mornings she came into the kitchen smiling, and those moments made everything worth it. 6 months after that morning, Jamie filed the paperwork for permanent guardianship, and we showed up at the courthouse on a Tuesday. Madison wore a blue dress she picked out herself and kept smoothing down the fabric with her hands. The judge reviewed all the documents, including letters from Madison's therapist and Detective Santos, about how well she was doing in my care. Jamie presented the case explaining how Madison came to live with me and why permanent guardianship served her best interests. The judge asked Madison directly if this was what she wanted, and Madison nodded, so hard I thought her neck might hurt. Her voice came out quiet, but clear when she said yes, she wanted to stay with me. The judge signed the order right there, making it official, and Madison grabbed my hand so tight. Tears ran down her face, but she was smiling bigger than I'd ever seen. We walked out of that courthouse and she kept saying thank you over and over until I told her she didn't need to thank me for anything. A year went by faster than I expected, and Madison kept getting better bit by bit. Her therapist said she was making real progress working through everything that happened. Madison started talking about maybe trying regular school next fall instead of online classes, which felt like a huge step. I started a support group for people like me who were guardians of trafficking survivors, because I kept meeting others who needed help figuring things out. Tiana's new foster mom joined the group last month. Felt good knowing those girls were still connected somehow. My parents called sometimes, and the conversations were short and uncomfortable, but at least they were trying. Madison told me one night that I made the right choice that day in the hospital parking lot, and hearing her say that made my chest feel tight. Some days were still really hard when Madison had nightmares or couldn't get out of bed. But we were building something real together, and watching her slowly start trusting the world again made every single sacrifice worth it.